And so now we've seen an introduction to lists and tuples. And lists and tuples actually represent ways to store sequences and data. And a type of data is a sequence. So here we see an example of a list, and here we see an example of a tuple. And these end up being 2-element sequences. So what is a sequence? Well, sequences are defined by two main things. They have a finite length, and they also support element selection. Basically, all elements have a particular index that can be used to access this element. So what does that mean? Let's say we have the following sequence: 2, 5, 3, 7, and 0. So this is a 5-element sequence, and the first element in the sequence corresponds to 0th index. So this is where when I was getting the x-coordinate, I knew the first element in the sequence was the x-coordinate, so I need to get the 0th index. So this is the type of syntax we can use for this. And I'll show you more examples of this so you get comfortable with this. But basically, every single element, so if I want the 4th element in a list, I need to get the 3rd index. If I want to get the nth element in the list, I need to get the n-1th index. So that's basically the pattern between the indices and the actual order of the elements. And again, lists and tuples are two examples of sequences. So let's look at some more stuff we can do with lists. Let's say I define a list being 2, 4, 5, 6, 7, okay? And I also define another list. List 2 being, 1, 2, 3. Okay, so let's say I want to get the 4th element of my first list. Well, how do I get the 4th element? I get list of the 3rd index. Okay, so what's the 4th element of the first list? It should be 6. So I should get 6 from this, and I get 6. Alright, now if I want to get the last element of my second list, what I can do is I can access list 2 of 2, because I want to get basically the 3rd element, so I need the 2nd index. So that's how that works. And then if I want the first element of any list, I always get the 0th index. And now one thing interesting is, let's say I want to get the 10th element of the first list. There's no 10th element, obviously, so what happens is we get a list index out of range. And so basically the range of indices that we can use is that we can use from 0 to basically the length of the list minus 1. So how do we find the length of a list? Well, we just put length of the list, and we get the following. So, and also, let's look at some interesting operations we can do with lists. We can also add lists together. So if I want to add list 1 and list 2, intuitively, it combines the lists. Okay? And then, let's say we can also do another operation where I can do addition as well as I can multiply lists. So actually, no, let me multiply this by 2. Let's see what happens. We get the following. So basically, multiplication of lists basically replicates the list and puts them together. So that's how this all works. And then the last thing I want to show you is we can also do nested lists, and we can basically have a list that has lists within it. So the first element of this list is going to be the list 1, 2, and the second element of this is going to be the list 3, 4, 5. So this is an example of nested lists. So it looks like this. And now what's the first element of my nested list? It's the first list. And if I want the second element of my nested list, I get 3, 4, 5. So then the next natural question is, what if I want to get the individual numbers? Well, if I want to get 2, what I need to do is I need to get the first element of my list, right? Because that's where 2 is in. And I need to get the second element of that list, and that corresponds to the first index. So I get 2 as a result. And if you want to get 5, well, what I can do is I need to get the first element of the outer list, and then inside that I need to get the third element, and that corresponds to the second index. And that's how I get my number 5. So that's how some of the general list processing operations work. And now we're going to talk about more operations, mainly iteration through a sequence with a for loop, list comprehensions, and list slicing. And I'll be explaining them as we go. So let's talk about the for loop. And to introduce this, I'm just going to go over something very basic that we might want to do with lists. Let's say I want to print the items of a list. Okay? So using what we know with lists and iteration in general, one way we can naturally define this is I could have an index starting at 0, and while it's the case that the index is less than n, I just print I just print basically the list at the list element, the element in the list at the appropriate index, and of course I increment my index, and that's all I need to do. So let's make sure this works. Print items on a list 1, 2, 3. I should get 1, 2, 3. Oh, I need to call it, of course. I can't do that. So that's a noob error right there. Oh, yeah, of course. I don't know why I said n. I had to find the length of the list. So, yeah, again, don't be like me and make these stupid mistakes. This should work, hopefully. Alright. So, print items and I get 1, 2, 3. Okay, so that's how this works. And not an excuse, but the reason I made so many errors on this is because I never use this, because there's a better way to do this. Okay, so let me show you the better way to do this. That makes it a lot easier and doesn't let you make stupid mistakes like I did. So the way we can use this is we can use a for loop. And the for loop is so beautiful because I can just individually get the elements out of the list. So for every element in the list, I want to just print the element. So, and this does the exact same thing as this more complicated version. So let's just make sure it works, and it does. So this and this work exactly the same. You can always use a while loop instead if you like the while loop, but the for loop is just, in my opinion, more elegant. So let's talk a little bit about how the for loop works. The for loop basically evaluates the expression first, and this expression must be evaluated to something called an iterable value. And I'll be talking a lot more about iterable values later, but for now, just think of it as a sequence. And of course, a list is a type of sequence, so that's why this works. And then now, for every element in the sequence in the order that they are presented, we first bind the name to the element in the current frame, and then we execute the body of the for loop. So here, what we did in this example is we first evaluated this list. Well, the list we passed in was 1, 2, 3, right? So that evaluates to 1, 2, 3. And then the first thing it does is it goes to the first element of the list, which is 1. Then it prints it, and then it repeats. It goes to the second element, then prints that, then goes to the third element, then prints that, and we get this. So that's how a for loop works. Now, I also want to talk about something very interesting you can do with for loop. It's called unpacking elements. And here we have a nested list, which we've seen before, and what we can do is, because it's a nested list that has inner lists of the same length, we can unpack these elements by just calling for x, y in pairs. So how does this work? Well, whenever you get some outer element, an element in a list, you can basically, so what's the element in this list? It's the inner list, 1, 2. And then 1, 2 has two special things. So this is basically, what this is doing in on a high level, is saying x, y is first bound to 1, 2. And what does this do? Well, what's x? And then what's y? So this is how this works. Alright. So this is something interesting you can do with lists. And it only works if the inner lists have the same number of elements. Because obviously, if you had a 1, 2, and then like a 3, 4, 5, you can't do this. So like what you can't do is this. You can't say x, y is equal to 1, 2, 3. At least I don't think you can. Yeah. There's too many values to unpack. So they expected 2, but they got 3 values. That's how that works.